It would have been very dark when the women began to gather. Quite dark as they made their way through the streets. They had gotten up very, very to do their job. They had slept very little in any case. No one felt much like sleeping. They had all prepared their burial spices before the Sabbath day had begun and rested the Sabbath according to the commandment. And they'd all agreed that they would get up very early and they would make their way to the tomb at daybreak. Very few people would be up and stirring, and it would all be easier for them to do it that way. There's one major problem as they met, whispering in the dark, that they had not solved, and they didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to get the tomb open and how they would roll that big stone back. The death of their master had left them all in a state of shock, and so it's not surprising that they wouldn't have had all their act together on this Sunday morning. Everything had happened so fast. Everything was going along normally. Everything was as it always had been, and the next thing they knew, he was dead, buried. Now, they were really kind of numb, going through the actions and emotions of caring for the dead because it was their duty. It was what women did. It was what was expected of them. And also, they were doing it because they loved him so much. He had become such a great part of their life. They depended on him so much. They came to the entrance of the tomb just as there was enough light in the eastern sky to see their way. And the first thing they noticed was that the guard was gone. And that was odd. The second thing they saw was that the tomb was already open, and that was a shock. It is really hard to overstate the emotional impact of that moment on this collection of women who was there on this morning. Their first realization that Jesus was gone and what that might mean and how they could interpret it and how they could respond to it. And it's hard today, nearly 2,000 years later, to fathom the doubt, the fear, the confusion, and the joy that they would experience before that day is over, and to really understand what it meant to them, to learn that Jesus was not dead after all. He was alive. In the weeks that followed, the women told their stories, the other witnesses told their stories over and over and over again. And they became a part of the testimony of the early church to the resurrection of Jesus. And now, 2,000 years later, we struggle with the details still of what happened on that morning. It was there. The stories are confused and confusing in many ways. And we still try to figure out, well, who was there? What were they doing? What sequence did some of these things happen in? We have only the least feeling of the impact of this day on the disciples, upon their emotions, their psychology, and everything else about them. But their confusion and their wonderment comes through 2,000 years later as a testimony of what happened on that day and to the truth of it. Now, when a modern reader picks up a book and flips it open and starts to read a story, he expects to read a story in the traditional sense. It should have a beginning and a middle and an end. There should be a time sequence to the things that take place. If there's a flashback, it should tell us that there's a flashback or give us a clue so we can figure out what's going on. We expect it all to be noted for us, and we expect the writer to treat us fairly as he goes into this. Now, actually, this works very well in the Bible if you just read one gospel at a time. And, of course, if you stop to ponder for a moment that the men who wrote these gospels anticipated that that's how people would read them. In fact, I am of the opinion that not one of the synoptic gospels had seen any of the other synoptic gospels when they wrote theirs. I think it's entirely likely that John had seen the other three when he wrote his account, because he does not cover a lot of the same material. He doesn't see any point in it. He has a perspective. He has a message that he feels need to be told that the others had not gotten straight, or hadn't gotten full and complete, or hadn't really managed to recall. And so he puts a different spin, not spin, but a different approach to the story from what they do. I think that the gospel writers really expected that their gospels would be read out loud to congregations from start to finish like a story. And if you read the gospel accounts that way, just read one all the way through, they're understandable, you have very little difficulty. But when you read them all, and especially if you got a harmony of the gospels and you try to read them together and harmonize them, we quickly run into difficulties, and the modern reader is tempted to cry foul. But the gospel accounts are not really stories so much as they are testimony. And when you understand the power of the idea of witnesses and testimony in the Bible, and how central this concept is to what is being written in the Bible, a lot of things begin to become clearer and take on a lot more power than they otherwise might have to a casual reader. And these stories were written down by these men, not so much just to tell a bit. They're not biographies. They are testimonies to what these men knew, experienced, and touched of the life and the ministry, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. And it's important to understand how this testimony came to be written so you can grasp what's going on in this thing. There are a number of things that can affect a person's testimony. The place you were standing when the events took place can change everything. For a person standing over there might see one set of things. A man standing over here might be screened from some of those things and not see them at all. And if these events are taking place in more than one place, one man may have been here when this event took place. Another man was over there and didn't see it at all. So you have to keep that in mind. Later events can happen that suddenly give meaning to things or facts that you did not consider important at the time you saw them. And so consequently, they come rolling back in on you as the story develops, and then they find their way into your testimony, and they otherwise might not have been there. If you're in court, the rules of evidence can have an effect on testimony. What is allowed and what is not allowed in evidence might be brought into play along the way. For example, we get quite a bit of hearsay in the New Testament, in these gospel accounts about the resurrection of Christ, along with eyewitness accounts. But we are allowed, in this case, to consider this evidence and to weigh it alongside of everything else. The events surrounding the resurrection of Jesus are reported to us by the witnesses. But I think it's fair to say that the facts are in something of a jumble. For one thing, the events were not written down for some 30 years after they had taken place. Now, that's not as big a problem in the first century as it would be today. I don't know if you're aware of this, pretty well attested, that the human memory and our ability to remember things has deteriorated significantly since the invention of the printing press. That because prior to that time of the necessity of memorizing a lot of stuff and holding these facts in our mind, men's memories were trained better, used more effectively, and they hung on to their facts. Today, I am prone not to allow certain facts into my memory at all, because I know I can go get it from a book or from the internet or someplace like that. If I got to have it, I'll go get it. I don't want to trouble. I don't want to take up space in my memory banks with that information. It's already crowded in there anyway. But, of course, that's fallacious all the way. I have very little doubt that if I worked harder at putting more stuff in there, I would find that I could get more in than I thought I could, and that it would open up avenues of memory. I'm afraid we have become very lazy since the inventing of the printing press, okay? But in the first century, this was not true. And memorization and the recollection of events was extremely important in that society, and people's memories were trained. And I think you would really be surprised to find how much of the Psalms, the rest, and other Old Testament books, a Jewish youth of that generation, even a teenager, would have been able to recite back to you verbatim and not have dropped a word. It's times have changed. So that 30-year elapsed period from the time of the events until the testimony was written down is nowhere near the handicap that it would be in our world today. Not at all. And in fact, the story was told again and again and again and again in church every week throughout the church. I mean, we come to church today, Matthew is here. Tell us again. Tell us again. What happened? And they recounted it, and questions were asked, and penetrating, challenges were offered to them. And they had to rack their memories and pull up things they might have forgotten and pull them together again. And as time went by, and as they grew personally, they began to understand certain things Jesus said. They didn't understand at all when he made the statement originally. But they remembered it. Perhaps the Holy Spirit brought it back to their recollection through the events that took place. So we have to understand that all of these things were very important. 30 years that passed does not diminish in any way the truth that the witnesses tell, but it drastically reduces detail. And that's where you and I have our problems with it, because they always say the devil is in the details, and we really want the details. I don't know, maybe it's 20th century man, but we really like details and we want to know what they were. The story as reported in the Gospel is compiled in blocks of information that come from different sources, different vantage points, different experiences of the same events. And the witnesses, by the time it was all written down, had told their stories over and over again, so they were well known to the church, even memorized, while the witnesses were still there to clarify and to correct, especially to correct somebody who tried to throw some curve into the testimony of the early church. And I think it's important to remember this, that the testimony that you read in the four Gospels is not merely the testimony of the four men involved. It is the testimony of the first century church to the events that took place. Because they were there. They experienced it too. And they were there to challenge, to argue with, to put right mistakes that were made in the telling of the story. Because the interesting thing about this story, the events that took place on this morning, the early events, not one of the New Testament Gospels writers was there. They had to get the testimony from the women who were there. And so all those women were still around, and trust me, you were not going to run a bad story on that morning by those women without them standing up and saying, no, that wasn't the way it was. Okay? So 2,000 years later, we struggle with these blocks of information, trying to piece together the story. We know it is the truth, but a lot of the details still elude us. Let's take a look at this on this Wave Sheaf Sunday, at the events of that Wave Sheaf Sunday nearly 2,000 years ago. Because this is an important day. It really is. We'll start with Matthew's testimony, but this particular day is a watershed day for the worship of God throughout all time. Matthew chapter 28 is where we're going to begin. We're going to begin with verse 1. After the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to see the sepulchre. Now this poses no problem if you just read Matthew. But when you read the other accounts, and it slowly dawns on you that Matthew was not there, you will also find that these two Marys were not the only women who were there on this occasion. Which brings to mind the fact that Matthew is giving us hearsay evidence. We will admit it because we find that from other testimony that the testimony is true, even though it may not be entirely accurate. Now, I wouldn't doubt for a moment that it would really disturb somebody to learn that Ronald had said that Matthew's account was not entirely accurate. But the fact is that if Matthew had been entirely accurate, he would have told us that Salome was there, which he didn't bother to mention us. There is a small distinction between truth and accuracy. It bothers people, but it shouldn't. It's normal in receiving testimony. The question is not so much whether it's accurate in all of its details. The question is it the truth that is being told to us here. And Matthew tells us the truth, even though he omits some details that we would like very much to have had. This little distinction has to be borne in mind. Matthew manages, though, to paint in a part of the picture which confirms what we learn elsewhere and gives us some background. Now, he says this, and then he says in verse 2, and I want to point out to you that verses 2, 3, and 4 are parenthetical. They are put in here just simply to add one other item of background as to how it was that when these two women showed up at the tomb, it was open, which was a problem. They were worried about this problem, is how they were going to get that stone rolled back. And they didn't have any idea they were going to get those soldiers to help them do it. Okay, so here, this is parenthetical. Behold, there had been a great earthquake, for the angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat on it. His countenance was like lightning, and his raiment white as snow, and for fear of him the keepers did shake and became like dead men. And I don't doubt that for a moment. With a huge earthquake, all of a sudden the stone goes rolling back, and this incredible, great, shining, face-like lightning being is there. They'll probably passed out on the spot. Immediately that took place. Now again, they are parenthetical. These are put in here and inserted to explain why the tomb was open so the women could go in. They are not inserted to show the time of the earthquake. That's not why they are here. I said that there were no witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus, so we have no testimony as to the time of his resurrection. Someone disputed that to me in a letter not long ago, saying that the soldiers were witnesses because they were there when the earthquake happened. They were there when the angel came and the stone was rolled back. However, there is no suggestion that they saw Jesus in the process. And nobody would be particularly interested in the testimony of those soldiers one way or the other, because we know they turned out to be liars for money. They could only testify as to the time of the earthquake and to seeing the angel, and that may or may not have been the moment of the resurrection. There's nothing here to tell us that. All we can say with certainty is that sometime before the first witnesses arrived at the tomb, Jesus was raised from the dead and the tomb was opened. We know nothing from testimony of the timing of these events. We can infer from surrounding events that the earthquake took place not long before the women got there. We can infer the time of resurrection from other scriptures, like 3 days and 3 nights. But otherwise, we're speculating. We draw our inferences, which are quite legitimate to draw inferences. But beyond that, we cannot say for sure, because there are no witnesses to this. But the opening of the tomb was not to let Jesus out. It was to let the witnesses in. So that event does not time the resurrection. So passing over the parenthetical section, let's continue with the testimony as it was given. After the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to see the sepulchre. And the angel answered and said to the women, verse 5, "Fear not, I know you seek Jesus which was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen as he said." You know, I know he told you this, and I know you didn't get it, but nevertheless, it happened, like he said. I want you to come in here and see the place where the Lord lay, and go quickly and tell his disciples that he's risen from the dead, and behold, he goes before you into Galilee. There you shall see him. Lo, I have told you. So the majority of the disciples never saw Jesus until they saw him in Galilee. And Paul lets us in on the secret that some 500 people saw him at one time. We have no idea how many people saw him all together. We only know that at one occasion there were 500 of them at once. So, after all this is done, the angel said, "Go on up there and see and tell them this." Now, the angel may have been fairly matter-of-fact about this, you know. Okay, come on, look, he's not here. Now go tell these people. But I will promise you, it is impossible. These women were not matter-of-fact about it. By the time they understood what had gone on, they were beside themselves. They departed quickly from the sepulchre with fear and great joy, and did run to bring the disciples word. And as they went to tell the disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, "All hail!" And they came and held him by the feet and worshipped him. And Jesus said, "Don't be afraid. Go tell my brothers that they go on into Galilee, and they will see me there." Now, when they were going, some of the watch came into the city and showed the chief priests the things that are done. Now, if our translation is all correct in the way it's presented, it comes across, it sounds like the men may have recovered and left that area just moments before the women arrived. And so the women arrived, they were on their way, the women then took off running to meet the disciples, and while this was going on, these men went in and showed the chief priest all the things that were done. Now let's pull in the blocks from Mark's testimony about this section and see how they fit. It'll be Mark 16 in verse 1. Remember, each one of them has pieces of this story which they are filling in. When the Sabbath was passed, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome had bought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him. And so very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came to the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. Now we find out that Salome was there, which Matthew may not have known. May not have known. Either he didn't know it, or maybe he didn't think it was important enough to mention it, because he mentions the two most significant players. But he did know the two of them. Salome, though, was also there. Mark knew that. Who knows? Maybe Mark got his part of this story from Salome rather than the two Marys. And they said among themselves, "Who's going to roll the stone away from this thing?" And when they looked, they saw it was already back. It was very great. And entering into the sepulchre, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, clothed in a long white garment. Notice, not on the left side, on the right side. I mean, the details, some of them are there that are missing elsewhere. And, you know, you get the impression from Matthew's account the angel was outside sitting on the stone. Apparently, by the time the women got there, he had moved inside and was waiting for them. As far as what they could see, he looked like a young man. The face that was like lightning is not there at this particular moment, because there's no particular reason to frighten these ladies any more than they're going to be frightened anyway. So they were scared by this, and he said, "Don't be afraid. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. Look, right there. That's the place where they laid him. See? He's gone. You go your way. You tell Peter and his disciples he goes before you into Galilee, and you will see him there. So quickly and fled from the sepulchre, for they trembled. I imagine they were shaking like a leaf, and they were amazed, and they didn't say anything to anybody because they were afraid. Now, here are details that Matthew does not include. By the time they got there, the angel was no longer sitting on the stone of the door, scaring the guards to death. He was inside. And here we learn that the women went inside, which we didn't get from Matthew's account. They found a young man who was obviously an angel. Now, having picked those blocks up and set them into the picture, let's look at Luke's account and see how his testimony fits. 23. Now, Luke is something of a historian, and he seems to have been more methodical than any of the synoptic gospels in his approach to the question at hand, and also as he does in the book of Acts. He is much more in the mold of a modern historian, or somebody who would tell the story as you and I would expect the story to be told. In Luke 23 and verse 55, he says, the women also that came from Galilee followed after and beheld the sepulchre and how his body was laid. And they returned and prepared spices and ointments and rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment. All this part of the story seems to be consistent. Now, upon the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came to the sepulchre, bringing the spices they had prepared, and certain others with them. They found the stone rolled away from the sepulchre. They entered in and did not find the body of Jesus. And it came to pass, as they were much perplexed about this, 2 men stood by them in shining garments. Now, I don't really know, as I said, how they got the story and why we have this small variance in the story. On the one occasion, it's a man in a long white garment, and just a man. On this occasion, 2 men in shining garments. I don't know how to take that, but I do know that it is a simple matter to understand that the women were telling the story, and they told it again and again and again. And different women were telling the story to different people as they went along. And so it was picked up, brought into the church. It was a true story, but the details differed depending upon which woman you were hearing it from. Not to say that any of it is untrue, but to say that there is a complete story here that nobody quite got together. And they were afraid and bowed down their faces to the earth, and they said, why are you looking for the living among the dead? Nobody bothered to tell us that. I'm glad somebody remembered it, because it kind of suggests a little sense of irony by these angels that are standing there. Hi, girls. What are you doing here? You're looking for the living among the dead? He's not here. He's risen. Don't you remember how he spoke to you while he was in Galilee, saying, I've got to be delivered in the hands of sinful men and be crucified and the third day rise again? Don't you remember that? And they remembered his words. Now we get a rather more detailed message in Luke's account, which suggests, frankly, that Mark and Matthew are giving us the gist of what was said. None of them are witnesses. Luke was not a witness either, but it appears to me that Luke was much more painstaking in getting the story than the rest of them were. All right, they returned from the sepulchre, and they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. It was Mary Magdalene and Joanna, the mother of James, and other women that were with him who told these things. And their words seemed to the apostles like idle tales, and they didn't believe a word. Now, we know now that there were at least 6, probably 7 or more women who came on this occasion. We know that it was Mary, the mother of James, Mary Magdalene, Salome was named. Now we have Joanna named. And also he says other women in the plural. Minimum of 6. The other women suggest 3 at least to me, so there were probably 7 or even maybe more women who were there at that time, which Matthew and Mark, I don't know, maybe they were male chauvinists and didn't think the number of women that was there was important. But we managed to glean the information from the accounts to understand it was a pretty good entourage that went out there. Now, I gather from these accounts that they were all aflutter by the time they got to the disciples and told them what happened. And I can really imagine that. They had to run and not walk together, breathless, red in the face, and you can be sure that they were all talking at once. I can hear Peter going over and nudging John and saying, who left the door to the hen house open? You can just imagine that kind of male chauvinist comment being made. They didn't believe the women. No one expected this to happen in spite of everything Jesus had said. And they felt the women had just, they'd seen some kind of a ghost or something, and they were all, bonkers over what had happened. Now, let's bring John into the picture, because you have a markedly different perspective with John, as always. John is writing much, much later, and has had a lot more time to digest the stories that have been told, a lot more time to think about the significance of events, and because he thinks about their significance, maybe remember things that other people had thought were not that important to include. John chapter 20, verse 1. The first day of the week comes Mary Magdalene early while it was dark to the sepulchre and sees the stone taken away from the sepulchre. No other women are there. He doesn't say they're not there, but the fact is you might assume in reading this account that Mary Magdalene came out there all by herself at this point in time. And yet we know from the other accounts that this was not true. There's a whole gaggle of ladies that had come out there on this morning to do this job and to be present. And this doesn't surprise me and shouldn't surprise anyone considering all that had happened. I mean, people want to go visit the grave after someone has died and been buried. And this is as natural as anything could possibly be. But with John, there is a singularly important story here that must be told, and the focus must be placed where it belongs for John's story. And the focus in John's mind is not just the women, it is Mary Magdalene in particular. And we'll see why. Mary Magdalene came early while it was dark to the sepulchre and saw the stone taken away. Then she ran and came to Simon Peter and the other disciple whom Jesus loved. Notice, not to the 11, but to 2 of them. And she said, they have taken away the Lord out of the sepulchre, and we don't know where they have laid him. John seems only have talked to Mary. You'd almost think about what happened. I don't know if he had or not. You never know the other women were there. But as I said, because of the singular story John has to tell, the other women don't seem to be that important, because Mary Magdalene experienced something on this morning that nobody else saw. No one else was there. It happened entirely to her and to her alone. In reading through this account, putting the blocks, laying them out, and maybe trying to get a timeline together, it sounds to me like Mary did not go straight into the sepulchre with the other women, but she bolted when she saw the tomb was open. What I visualize having happened is the women arrived there, the thing is open, their mouths are hanging open about what's taken place here. Women go inside, Mary Magdalene takes off and does not go in with the other women. She goes to get Peter and the others. Meanwhile, the women go looking for the disciples. Peter and John come running. Peter and the other disciple come running up to the tomb to see what's there. Mary Magdalene seems utterly unaware of the angel's message when she first goes to Peter and the others. And at this point, only 2 of the disciples actually go to see the tomb. Peter went forth and that other disciple, verse 3, and came to the sepulchre. And they both ran together. And the other disciple outran Peter and came to the sepulchre first. He stooped down, looked inside, and saw the linen clothes lying, but he wouldn't go in. Peter, right behind him, running and puffing, a little slower, probably a little bigger man. He followed him, and he got there. Peter didn't even hesitate. He just barged right on inside, as his character would lead him to do. And he saw the linen clothes lie, and the napkin that was about his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself. And then the other disciple went in that came first, and he saw and he believed. But as yet, they did not understand the scripture that he had to rise from the dead. Neither one of them. Think about that. Peter and another disciple here wander in there, and they still haven't got it in their minds that Jesus had to rise from the dead. So they went away again to their own house. And poor Mary stands outside crying. And as she stooped down and looked into the sepulchre, she saw 2 angels in white, sitting, one at the head, the other at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. And they said, "Woman, what are you crying for?" And she said, "They've taken away my Lord, and I don't know where you have laid him." She still has not heard the announcement that he was risen, apparently. She thinks his body was carried off somewhere. Mary thinks she's talking to a couple of workers, who probably came in and opened the tomb. And when she said that, she turned around and saw Jesus standing and didn't know who he was. And he said, "Woman, what are you crying about? Who are you looking for?" She thought he was the gardener. and said, "Sir, if you've taken him from hence, tell me where you've laid him, and I'll take him away. I'll take him off your hands. Just tell me where the body is." Because she still believes that Jesus is graveyard dead. And Jesus then said, "Mary?" And she turned back and looked at him and realized who it was and said, "Rabboni," Master. And Jesus said, "Don't touch me, for I am not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say, I ascend to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God." It's a completely different message from what the other women were given by the angels. The other women says, "Go tell him he's risen, meet him in Galilee." Jesus says to Mary, "You go tell him I'm ascending to my God, my Father, and their God, my Father and your Father." And so Mary came and told the disciples that she had seen the Lord, and he spoke these things to her. Now, why is this so important? It's extremely important in John's mind because it is clear to him, as it became clear to the early church, that Jesus was raised toward the end of the Sabbath. Probably it's right at sunset the night before. That early that morning he told her not to touch him because he had not ascended to his Father, that he was going to. Later in that day he allows himself to be touched and handled. And to anyone who understands, the Scriptures as far as what was going on that particular morning, who understands the concept of the Feast of First Fruits, and how they grasped as time went by that Jesus was the first of the first fruits, they would have made the immediate connection that Jesus ascended to the Father as a symbol of the first fruits at the same time and in the same way that the first omer of barley was taken into the temple and waved before God by the priest as a symbol of the first fruits from the ground, which opened the harvest then so that anybody could eat anything that had been harvested in that year. Prior to that time, they couldn't eat anything that had been harvested of that year's harvest. So the connection, just like that. The wave sheaf, Christ. Presentation in the temple of the wave omer, presentation of Christ to the Father in heaven. So that this day, and I mean this day today right now, was the watershed day in the history of the faith of God on this earth, because it was the day after Christ's resurrection when Christ was presented to the Father as the first fruits from the dead, as the book of Revelation puts it later. So it's an important day. Mary didn't grasp any of this at this time. Peter didn't get it at this time. Chances are John, who later will tell us about it, didn't really get it at this time. But when he gets around to writing this account, he focuses on Mary because that, to him, is the crucial and important event. It's utterly significant, I think, and fascinating, and has to be significant, that Jesus appeared first, not to Peter, not to John, not to any one of the apostles. He appeared to Mary Magdalene. And that's not all. No angel spoke to any of these men, not a one. They were there when the women got there. When the men got there, there was no angel in sight. At least the men didn't see him. So there was no angel there. The angels didn't talk to him, only to the women. You know what I think? My guess is that the profound love of this collection of women for Jesus had to be rewarded. They loved him more than the apostles loved him in their own special way. And Jesus' affection for them, I think, is revealed on this morning, as it was only to the women that the angels appeared and made the announcement, and it was only to one woman that Jesus appeared first. Of all the people he might have shown himself to. And you think about this. If Jesus had shown himself first to Peter, he really probably would have established Peter as the one true apostle that everybody had to obey from now on out. And he had no intention of doing that. So he appears to Mary Magdalene, a woman out of whom he cast 7 devils. And tradition tells us that Mary Magdalene was actually a prostitute. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's widely believed in Christian circles. That he goes out to a woman who was originally possessed of 7 demons. She was a total, complete wreck, a woman whom he had rescued. That's the woman he reveals himself to first and makes the announcement. I really, frankly, believe that this is an extremely important and a significant event, and that the message it sent was not to be missed. John is very careful to see to it that we don't miss it. But it was apparently not clear early on in history. The women, by the way, I realize they were women, it's women's duty, but they were the only ones who cared enough to go to the tomb on Sunday morning. They went, and they were rewarded for having gone. Now let's go back to Luke's testimony at this point and see where it takes us. Luke 24, verse 12. Then arose Peter and ran to the sepulchre, and stooping down he beheld the linen clothes laid by themselves. And he left, wondering in himself what had happened. What on earth, has happened here? He still doesn't have it. Well, behold, two of them that same day went to a village called Emmaus, which was about 80 furlongs from Jerusalem. And they talked of all the things that had happened. And as they were walking along, gabbing about this, Jesus drew near and began to walk along with him. But their eyes were held back that they could not recognize him, did not know who he was. And Mary didn't recognize him either. Some change had taken place. And he said to them, what are you all talking about walking around here? Why are you so sad? I mean, you could walk up to these guys and tell by the long faces they were really down about this. Now, this is strange, too, in a way, about their sadness. Because listen to how this plays out. One of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered and said, what, are you a stranger in Jerusalem and you don't know what's happened these days? And he said, what are you talking about? And they said, concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death and have crucified him. But we trusted that he was he that should have redeemed Israel. And beside all that, today is the third day since these things were done. Now that particular last phrase is a very curious thing that they should say that here. Why did they even make mention of the third day concept? Why was it even relevant? It's not clear. And were they just giving an idle time reference? It's been 3 days. It's also not clear what they mean by these things. You really can't draw much in the way of firm conclusions from what these guys said. But they went on, though, and they said, yea, and certain women of our company made us astonished, because they were early this morning at the sepulchre, and they didn't find his body. And they came saying that they had seen a vision of angels, that he was alive. And they didn't believe a word of it, folks. They didn't believe it. Certain of them that were with us went to see the sepulchre and found it like the women said, but they didn't see Jesus. Now, the reason I say they didn't believe it is because they were still sad. Jesus walks up to them and says, why are you so sad? Well, they were sad because they thought he was dead. That's why. They didn't believe these women. They didn't know what had happened to them, but they didn't believe the resurrection of Christ had taken place. And he said, oh, fools and slow of heart. He said, slow of heart to believe all the prophets have spoken. Shouldn't Christ have suffered all these things and to enter into his glory? And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded all the scriptures concerning himself to these guys walking along the road. They drew near the village where they were going, and he was going to keep on walking. They constrained him and saying, stay with us, it's toward evening, and the day is far spent. So we went in and spent some time with him. And as he said it, meat with them, he took bread and blessed it and broke it and handed it to them. And their eyes were open, and they knew him. And as soon as they knew him, he vanished. This is, what are you going to say? You've been talking about with this guy, walking down the road with this guy. And they said, oh, didn't our hearts burn when we listened to him talking by the way, and we didn't know it was. And then at this moment of time, suddenly, and then he's gone. I mean, you talk about whiplash. The emotional whiplash these people went through was staggering to consider. And it also is revealing to us, first of all, we know the bodily resurrection of Jesus took place. His body was gone. But secondarily, we also know he's passing through doors, vanishing and appearing as though he were a spirit. What all that means is another matter, but it was an incredible moment. What a moment that had to be when those guys suddenly realized who he was, realized he was alive, and then suddenly to have him just as quickly, without even getting so much as to say, he's gone. They were terrified. In verse 37 it says, and scared and supposed that they had seen a spirit. I'm sorry, I've lost my place here where I am. Oh yeah, there we go. Verse 32. They said to one another, did not our heart burn within us while he talked with us by the way, and while he opened to us the scriptures? And they rose up the same hour and returned to Jerusalem and found the 11 gathered together, and those that were with him, saying, the Lord is risen indeed and has appeared to Simon. So by that time, he had appeared to Peter. So they told them what things were done in the way and how he was known of them in taking bread. And then, while they were sitting there saying, now, He broke bread, and he just disappeared from our sight, and they had no more said those words than bang, Jesus was there. Now, those poor guys, I'm telling you, by the time this day was over, they must have been fit to be wrung out and really in rough shape. But he said, peace be unto you. Peace? Good grief. How in the world are you going to be at peace with people appearing and disappearing like this? They were terrified. They were affrighted. They thought it was a ghost. He said, what are you worried about? Why are you having these thoughts? Here, look at my hands. Look at my feet. Handle me. See. A spirit doesn't have flesh and bones as you see me have. John later in his first gospel will say, him whom our hands have handled of the word of life. And I'm sure they did. I'm sure they walked up to them. They touched him. They looked at his hands. They felt of his body. Are you really here? He showed them his hands and his feet. And they still wouldn't believe for joy. And wondered and said to him, he's still having a problem with him. He says, all right, do you have some food here? They gave him a piece of broiled fish and a honeycomb, and he took it and ate before them. The way it's worded is, the whole idea of eating is to eat before them so they can see him eat and say, see, I'm real. I'm not a ghost. Although, frankly, I could see why they were hard to convince on that particular issue, the way he came and went. He said to them, these are the words that I spoke to you while I was with you, that all things must be fulfilled which were written in the law of Moses and the prophets and in the Psalms concerning me. Then opened he their understanding that they might understand the Scriptures. And he said to them, thus it is written, and thus it behooved Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead the third day, and that repentance and remission of sins should be preached in his name among all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. And you are witnesses of these things. And behold, I send the promise of my Father upon you. You wait in the city of Jerusalem until you are endued with power from on high. He led them out as far as Bethany, lifted up his hands, and it came to pass as he blessed them, he was parted from them and carried up into heaven. Now, we have lost in the process of this story right here a passage of time. And he just skips over all kinds of intervening stuff that he doesn't think is that important. There's a lot more to the story, but these are the essential blocks of the story. Now, why have I told you all this? Well, I've told you all that because this is the day. Today. This year, it falls earlier than it normally does for us, but this is the day of the first appearances of Jesus to his disciples after his resurrection from the dead. And because this day is the fulcrum upon which the entire Bible turns. What we have gone through is the testimony of the witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. This honest, confused, happy, excited testimony is so natural, so unpretentious, that it has to be true testimony. If we were sitting on a jury, we would have no choice but to believe these people were telling us the truth. We would not be able to go back in a jury room and concoct any kind of an explanation that would account for the stories that we had been told being lies. There would be no way we would put it together that way. It's a far better story, a far more believable story than it would be if we had a single, coherent, logical, one-way through, written by some good author, story of what actually happened. Because we could believe that that one story was a fiction. But because of the fact that this one is written the way it is, there is no evidence of collusion on the part of the writers. There's every evidence of non-collusion on the part of the writers. Every clear evidence that some of them didn't know what the others had said by what they said because of the way the accounts differ. And far from being discrediting, these particular things are the ones that let us know that it is the truth and not a fabrication. Because these witnesses, while they may not be entirely accurate in all the points, are truthful in all of the points. We might be able to dismiss that one single coherent thing as a cock and bull story made up by some Jews, but we can't dismiss what we have got here. We have the natural jumble of real witnesses telling the truth about what they saw and what they experienced and trying to make sense out of it. Jesus was dead. Now he was alive. Jesus was dead. Now he was alive, and the implications of that simple fact echo down to us and back in time through all Old Testament history. This is the most important day in the history of the world. You can ignore the story if you can. Believe it if you will. And if you believe it, your life has got to change.